You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And I'm Martin Robbins.
This week, Martin has been trash-talking the Environment Agency, and we talked to the author of a brand new plan for Britain to actually do pioneering science much better. But first, don't worry, we found a credible reason to talk about trains. So, Martin, the really important thing when you've got a podcast is to be sensational and exciting, to keep people listening and keep the audience engaged and keep people wanting to listen week after week. So this week, I want to start our podcast by talking about a brand new report that's been published by the London Assembly's Budget and Performance Committee.
Yeah, and I mean, I know from experience, like listeners often stop me in the street and ask, when are we going to hear more from that really exciting Budget and Performance Committee that we've all been following avidly in the news? So it's great to start with some high-octane drama, James.
Honestly, this is actually quite a good and interesting report. So basically, they put out this report and it's got two puns in the name. This is why I like it. It's called Euston, We Have a Problem, mind the funding gap. Yeah, see, it's good. It's good. And what it basically is, it's a whole bunch of things that we like. It's saying a lot of things that I think listeners to this show, if you're sympathetic to the sort of stuff we bang on about, you'll be pretty in league with, because it's all about building stuff, basically, and how we can't build infrastructure, and it's trying to sort of figure out why. And interestingly, it's co-signed off by the entire committee. So it's like basically a cross-party thing where everyone seems to agree, yeah, this is a problem and we need to sort it out, because it's got, Neil Garrett, the Tory chair of the committee, who signed it. The Lib Dems are on there, Labour are on there, and even the Greens are on there. And actually, this was signed off by Zach Polanski himself, who's now a famous man.
Wow, old hypnotits. It's just like the biggest crossover event since Infinity Wars, James. Like, what's brought all of these mad people together?
Yeah, I'm hoping he can use his powers to enlarge London's public transport provision. So I don't want to get into all the details of the report because we could be here all week. But basically, like I say, it's trying to dig into why we can't build infrastructure, and it does all the sort of things, again, that we've slagged off over the months of doing this podcast. It slags off the Treasury. It talks about how getting planning permission is really hard and how projects are over-scoped and gold-plated and that sort of thing.
Well, that's incredible. It's really quite exciting and interesting, I guess, that such a broad group of people can be united around a common villain. And of course, that villain is the Treasury.
Yeah, it's really notable. And there were some genuinely really good recommendations in there. So I hope the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, takes a look at this and actually does what they recommend. Because, for example, they want to align boroughs and the mayor's planning powers in the southeast London, so you can do some land value capture and build the Bakerloo line. We've got a whole episode about that. Listeners, if you want to dig into the back catalogue, they've got a recommendation that London should be able to raise its own taxes and have some fiscal autonomy. We've talked about that as well. And they want the mayor as well to set out a new vision for transport for 2040. So there can actually be a whole pipeline of infrastructure projects rather than just doing on a sort of piecemeal basis.
I'm old enough to remember when we used to have visions for 2020. So it's pretty terrifying that we're now on 2040. It also seems a very long way away. I mean, we're pretty much all going to be retired then. We probably won't even be able to hobble onto public transport at that point. We'll just be bimbling around on our little mobility scooters and Zimmer frames.
Yeah, I think I'm weirdly interested in the Bakerloo line extension having like wheelchair accessibility at this point. So Martin, the big news though, I think from this report is all about Crossrail 2, the sequel to the original Crossrail, what we now call the Elizabeth line. And basically the committee has got together and said, well, let's start figuring out Crossrail 2 again, and let's actually get this thing into gear and get this thing started.
Which is fantastic, right? I mean, Crossrail 1 was pretty much an unmitigated success, even though a lot of people don't like to sort of mention it. Now, it's one of those things, it's a little bit like the O2 Arena, when the Millennium Dome was being built, it was kind of fashionable to say, oh, this is a big white elephant, it's a disaster. And many of those same people are now doing lucrative gigs in the O2 Arena. And in the same way that many people are now travelling to work on the Elizabeth line and saying it's their favourite tube line, having complained bitterly about it being built for about 15 years. So I imagine Crossrail 2, very much a similar vibe. A lot of knee-jerk reaction from people who will secretly enjoy it very much if it is ever built.
One day, Martin, I would love to do a historical deep dive podcast with you on the Millennium Dome, because I genuinely find it fascinating. I went there twice when it was actually the actual Millennium Dome, so I really liked it. I don't know why. Maybe that's about me.
We could investigate the cultural moment that was James Bond falling down the side of it in one of the Pierce Brosnan films. I think that really summed up in much the same way later on, like the 2012 Olympics would symbolise Britain at that pre-Brexit moment in time. I think James Bond paragliding or whatever it's called onto the Millennium Dome, kind of falling down the side of it, was a big moment for Britain, James. We didn't even have the wheel then. I think that was pretty much the only thing we could put in a film.
Well, maybe then, by the time Amazon finally reboots James Bond again, maybe we'll see him catch a Crossrail 2 train, and that will signify a new cultural milestone like these previous ones. Because, Martin, we are going to talk about Crossrail 2, so I'm going to talk about this now because it's fascinating and I want this to happen. So this is basically another railway. Think about Crossrail, something basically just as big, but on a slightly different axis. So Crossrail 1 was obviously east to west all across London. Crossrail 2, and this has been a plan that's been around for absolutely ages. I think this was first proposed in 1944, and this is going to be a new railway line that goes all the way from sort of northeast London, think sort of Hackney and the environs further northeast, all the way through central London and then down to southwest London, like Wimbledon, all the posh bits, the stockbroker belt, basically.
So it's effectively more like Thameslink too, James. So effectively taking people from the leafy suburbs of north of London to the leafy suburbs of south of London. I think one of the most remarkable things about Thameslink, other than the absolutely appallingly criminal levels of service on it, is the fact that I can go from my rural village in Bedfordshire directly to Gatwick Airport on the other side of London. Like, it's actually kind of bizarre and miraculous that's the thing that's possible, and for us posh people in the sort of ring around London, it's fantastic. We can go straight to our posh friends in the south without having to deal with all that nasty, grimy, crime-ridden stuff in between. No offense.
I think if we were doing this podcast 30 years ago, Martin, in addition to probably talking about, Power Rangers or something, we would probably be talking a lot about Thameslink 2000 and what a horrible nightmare that's been. But anyway, so Crossrail 2, it's been chugging away. So it was proposed after World War II. In the 70s and 80s, there was various reports going, it probably would be quite a good idea to have a railway line going this way. And then 2010, things get pretty serious, 2010, 2011 sort of time. TfL actually take it on as an active project and start planning for it. And they even got as far as safeguarding some of the routes. So basically saying you can't build there because we want to put a train there at some point in the future. That's probably the one sort of not building on land I actually approve of if you're going to build a train there in the future. So they safeguarded some of that. And just to sort of further sketch out the route of this planned railway, because the plans got quite far, and TfL were putting out all of these like renders in like tube map style maps showing where it would go to paint a picture. It would go from stations like Broxbourne and Cheshunt up, I guess they're up near you somewhere in the above London. I don't know. I live south of the river, and then it would go all the way down to like Alexandra Palace. That'll be a separate branch, and they would join up at Dalston, trendy Dalston in Hackney. They go through the central core of London, King's Cross, Tottenham Court Road, Victoria, then to Chelsea, and then it would sort of splinter off like tentacles in like 4 different branches to, well, like I say, all the posh places. So Hampton Court, Epsom, Chessington, all of those sorts of lines that currently go into Wimbledon. Like Crossrail joins up sort of weird little regional lines to the east and west of London. This would do the same thing to the northeast and southwest, basically.
Yeah, and weirdly sort of connects up some sort of up-and-coming, trendy, hipster neighbourhoods with stuff like Clapham Junction, which is in that sort of weird hole in the south of London. Well, some people would say a lot of South London is a hole, but specifically that kind of hole around Clapham where you sort of feel like there should be more going on there, but it's all a bit run down and not very well connected, and it sounds like a fantastic idea, James, especially if you're a pensioner in a flat in Chelsea who likes going to visit their posh children doing media work.
Exactly. And I think as well, the plan for central London as well, I think is a really interesting thing. So, like how the Elizabeth line has trains are so long, you have to combine certain stations. So like Liverpool Street Station, the Elizabeth line station is Liverpool Street and Moorgate. You go out one end, you get to massive Liverpool Street. You go out the other end, you get to massive Moorgate station. Crossrail 2 was going to have to do the same thing. And they want to build one of the stations will be a joint Euston and St Pancras station, which if you're not in London, these stations aren't next door to each other. It's not like King's Cross and St Pancras. There's probably like a 15-minute walk between them above ground, but they'll be served by just basically one massive underground platform.
So what are we going to call this? Like King's Cross and Euston Pancras? Like that's just becoming a ridiculous combination of stations at this point.
Maybe they could just call it London Central at this point. And yeah, Clapham Junction, Martin, like you were saying, that's also a really good station. This is another reason why this is a great place to build a railway, because weirdly, Clapham Junction, one of the busiest stations in the country by certain metrics. I think it's like number of trains passing through or something like that, because not as many people get off and on the train there, because like you say, there's not that much going on in Clapham Junction. But if you're changing trains, you have to change there. So like loads of people will come in there and then change train. And then if they want to get to the tube network at the moment, they have to go to Waterloo or Vauxhall, which is just, a pain in the arse. It's another bottleneck. So this could be another way of getting people sort of into that central London sort of tube network. I know the Crossrail is probably not technically a tube. I know people listening are going to kick off about that, but you know what I mean. It will get people onto trains directly into central London a lot sooner.
I guess this sounds probably a bit terrifying for certain people in Chelsea, say, because they're going to be directly connected to Clapham Junction for the first time?
Perhaps it will be terrifying. I remember reading, and I'm half remembering this now, I think Ian Visits posted about this several years ago. There was actually opposition to the idea of building a Crossrail 2 station in Chelsea, because they like being cut off from the rest of London, because it's all posh people with their massive cars or whatever. So they don't want the oiks being able to get there more easily.
I mean, essentially, it's like an inverse Isle of Wight, as we talked about the other week, because the Isle of Wight, as we know, is an island completely populated by oiks, but who want the similar thing. They're fed up with the idea of a train coming in, because then all these posh people from the mainland will turn up and ruin the place. What I would love to see, James, is sort of like Love Island, but populated exclusively by Island of Wighters and Chelsea people, just mingling in one village to see how they get on. And we can check back in on that experiment in 3 to 5 years and see who's alive still.
I mean, no bad ideas in a brainstorm, Martin, but I'm going to keep talking about Crossrail 2 as however much you want to divert onto Love Island chat or something. I don't understand. But basically, Crossrail 2, the really interesting thing is that despite all the chat and despite seemingly nothing happening, they have actually sort of started building it. When they built Tottenham Court Road, or rebuilt Tottenham Court Road for the original Crossrail, they actually pre-dug a whole bunch of tunnels that they're going to need that should we ever build Crossrail 2. They call it passive provision. So there's a whole bunch of stuff down there so that when we eventually bore the tunnels for Crossrail 2, we won't have to dig up the entire station again. We won't need a whole new station box that takes out a huge chunk of central London from above ground. They might even be able to burrow out the tunnels and all of the stuff from underground with relatively little stuff above ground, which would be quite cool. And the same is true for the British Library extension as well. So this is next door to King's Cross and Pancras Station. British Library are planning a big extension that's going to be built. This construction is going to begin next year. But they're building in, as part of the designs of it, basically a big old blank space where one day there could be an entrance to this new Crossrail 2 station. So, if we do ever finally build this thing, there will be some stuff there ready and waiting for it.
I'm surprised anything's happening at the British Library next year, given they've apparently still been reading from a cyber attack since God knows when. But speaking of things that may or may not happen, there's a report. Brilliant. Yeah. As we know, the best way to get anything done, James, is to have a committee get together and write something, and then it almost definitely happens. But is that going to be true in this case?
Yeah, so what's annoying about this is despite all of the planning that's been happening for decades, and despite TfL spending a good sort of 10 years seriously looking into building this thing, Crossrail 2 was basically killed back in October 2020. So at the time, the pandemic happened, TfL, technical term, they were basically fucked by the pandemic because no one was taking any of their transport anywhere. They didn't have as much money coming in. So they needed to go to the government for a bailout. They got 905 million quid in the end. But for some reason, one of the sort of strings attached to this was the government said to them, you need to stop doing any work on Crossrail 2. I mean, I don't know how many people were actively doing stuff at the time. Surely it couldn't have been more than a handful of people. So I'm not really sure how much money was being saved there. But as a result, they sort of paused the planning process and then they just gave up.
That's incredible. We're going to pay you money to just be basically passive and ineffective. And, that's how we like to empower our public institutions.
Yeah, it's maddening to think about. But that's why I think this is such a sort of notable report, Martin. It's the London Assembly. They're all getting together, literally every single of them saying, come on, let's just do this. Let's start planning again. Let's start preparing for Crossrail 2 because we know we're going to need it at some point in the sort of medium-term future. So let's just start the work again. And they mean business because in this report, they're very forceful. They say they want the Mayor of London to respond to this demand that Crossrail 2 start up again by the end of financial year 25-26. So it's a real urgent thing.
Christ, that might even be the same mayor, James. What a shocking thing. And so for those listeners who are looking forward to riding on this new Crossrail 2, when do we think it's going to be open, James? Soon? Next couple of years, 5 years, 10 years?
Just don't ask Martin. We won't like the answer.
So, James, there are people who say that we talk a lot of rubbish on this podcast, and they're about to be very happy people because this is an entire story about rubbish, specifically a big pile of rubbish that's been accumulating in a field in Oxfordshire. And you might ask, why are we talking about this on a podcast about abundance, aside from the fact that obviously it is an abundance of rubbish? But I think there's some really fascinating stuff here about kind of state capacity and failure, and basically why do we struggle to do anything in Britain in 2025.
Right, so I've seen a bit about this on the news, Martin, but I understand you've actually done some intrepid journalism and you actually visited the site itself. So can you describe it a bit? Do the pictures of this trash mountain do it justice?
Yeah, exactly. So I drove to the wilderness of central Oxfordshire and braved all the students and posh people and farmers and basically visited, as close to the site as I could. I'll be publishing a YouTube video and a Substack post early this week, hopefully Monday, about the same time this podcast goes out, possibly Tuesday if I'm honest, because Sunday is slipping away from me, James. But you'll see footage and everything in a lot more detail, and I'll go into it in a lot more on my Substack, which I am now relentlessly plugging. But even if you've seen the footage on the news, I don't think it conveys the sheer magnitude of what happened here. So to give you some context, it's a field, it's just off the A34, north of Oxford, near Oxford Airport, next to a town called Kidlington, which, as it would happen, is actually the home of Thames Valley Police. And Kidlington is quite a weird town to start with. When I visited there, and no offence to the people of Kidlington, it has a bit of an odd vibe. So the local Sainsbury's, it turned out, actually, I discovered this after I visited, is apparently a notorious crime hotspot. It's been mentioned on like GB News and other places. It's so notorious that they actually have this big CCTV monitoring station in front of the exit. So as you walk out with your shopping, there's like a uniformed guard watching TV screens of people in the shop. So there's sort of a very odd atmosphere in a town that is, let me remind listeners, literally the headquarters of Thames Valley Police.
Okay, Martin, so you set this up. It's a crime hotspot. So what's actually happened?
So anyway, the rubbish pile it's in a field just to the northeast of the town. And the first thing to say is that it's not just rubbish piled into a field, which is what a lot of the media reports kind of imply. So they've actually, whoever did this, excavated the entire site like a sort of massive landfill. So there are berms of earth, perhaps 10 feet high around the perimeter that they've constructed with JCBs and excavators running for hundreds of meters around the edge of the field. So this is a serious kind of like engineering project of the kind that we're normally quite bad with in the UK. And then the volume of rubbish that's gone into it is crazy. So the aerial photography that you see in the news, because it's from above, it tends to kind of flatten the view. And people on Facebook have said things like, oh, I bet they've done this so they can build a housing estate on it, or, put a road over it or something. But it's comparable in height to a small house. There are actually a couple of shipping containers handily parked in the next field to kind of, size it up against. And it's like twice the height of those. And it's about 170 meters long, which is the same, if you basically took the gherkin in London and just, tipped it over, obviously you'd upset a lot of office workers, but it would be roughly comparable in kind of length to the rubbish tip. My rough calculations are that you would need something like 400 or 500 bin lorries to move that amount of rubbish.
That's quite a big operation, Martin. I presume you spent hours with a supercomputer crunching that, trying to work it out, trying to simulate bin lorries or something like that. So how did nobody notice this for so long? Because part of the striking thing, like you say, is this has clearly been accumulating over quite a long time, and then it sort of made news quite recently.
Yeah, and I mean, it's right off, if you drive on the A34 into Kidlington, it's right off the slip road. But actually, when you look at the site and you kind of walk around it and the area and you look at it on Google Earth, it's kind of the perfect site if you were going to do something like this. So it's a weirdly shaped field that's kind of screened off by trees, even from the fields around it. It's just off the A34, so it's very, very easy to get heavy goods vehicles there. And it's not really connected to anything. There's nothing else really around it other than a couple of other sort of light industrial kind of areas. The only footpath that actually goes through the land, in theory, would never really be used by anyone, because at one end, it basically terminates behind a crash barrier on the side of a main road. And there's no like footpath or anything particularly there that would lead to it. And then at the other end, it just comes to a stop in this little country lane at the end of a field. And again, there's no parking on that lane. There's no other footpath that kind of connects to it. So really, other than the old sort of dedicated angler trying to reach a particular spot on the River Cherwell, there's just no reason why anyone would really go there and disturb you. So it's kind of fantastic. And they've built an entire entrance for this site as well. So if you look on Google Street View back in 2024, there's like a little farmer's gate. They've taken that out. They've widened the entrance. They've tarmacked it. Again, it's perhaps one of the finest examples in Oxfordshire of Britain actually building something recently. And this would have been going on for a number of months, right? So probably the spring they were excavating the site, and then in June they began to fill it. And this is where the story kind of gets murky, and where we have to talk about, James, the crack institution that has led the investigation into this massive crime. And that, of course, is the Environment Agency.
I thought you were about to say the police, Martin. So I guess this is an environmental thing. I can see why the Environment Agency would be involved, but why did they get the job?
Yeah, I guess because it's an environmental crime, and so the Environment Agency are sort of the specialists in that area. But it does sort of seem weird that Thames Valley Police have shown no real interest in this case at all. Maybe they're too busy dealing with the shoplifters in the local Sainsbury's, who knows? But essentially, people were reporting suspicious activity back in June. So there were reports of basically convoys of lorries coming to the site, tipping rubbish, into the sort of entrance area of the field, and then like excavators and JCBs like taking it and packing it down into the landfills. And then on July the 3rd, the Environment Agency apparently sent people to the site. They had a look at it, and they decided, James, that it was a site that it was at high risk of fly tipping. Possibly they were tipped off by the thousands of tons of rubbish that were already in the field. So they did what any crack team of investigators would do. They sent a strongly worded letter in the form of a cease and desist, but they didn't launch any other investigation as far as I can tell after that. Now, they say in a recent statement that they've been investigating since July, but there's really not much evidence of anything else happening until basically October. So having decided the site was at high risk, they didn't get a court order to close the site until, I think, October the 23rd, which is like almost 4 months later. And that's after they received further reports saying that the fly tipping was still happening, because apparently, a letter didn't work, I guess. And then it's only in the middle of November that reports started appearing in the media. It came to attention. And only after that the Environment Agency starts issuing statements. They start talking about, maybe we'll have to clean up the site. Maybe we should try and protect the River Cherwell that flows right next to it. And in fact, it's only in literally the last week that they've properly fenced off the site, declared that it's a crime scene, and said that they're going to put 24-hour security on it. So the response has been very, very slow, and much of it has been suspiciously timed after, for example, Keir Starmer has made a statement about it, or it's appeared on the BBC.
That is interesting timing, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly like a massive scale of operations. Of course, we don't want to speculate here, and actually there's been a lot of quite bad speculation around this as well. So people on Facebook have targeted neighbouring landowners, assuming that they had something to do with the site. And I actually spoke to one guy in the area who's had all sorts of problems. He's had to remove listings for his business because he was starting to get harassment and abuse.
The plain sight aspect seems to be sort of fascinating to me. I guess it's a bit like how you can put on a high vis and seem to get into anywhere. Like there's YouTube videos of I saw one a few years ago of a guy putting on a high vis and just walking into behind the scenes of a major London entertainment venue. And he was poking around with his camera just because, the high vis was like the pass to sort of get in, and nobody batted an eyelid. But anyway, so Martin, what sort of waste was being dumped here, I guess?
Well, I think the high-vis thing is kind of pertinent, because I think judging by the waste that's there, probably to wherever the waste originally came from, this would have seemed like a legitimate operation. But the waste that's been dumped is large-scale kind of commercial office-type waste, right? So plastics, cardboard, lots of paper. And it's not just being sort of collected and dumped, like it's being processed to some extent as well. So I think it's almost like the first stages of making like MDF or hardboard or something where they've started to kind of churn it up and kind of mix it in with other bits of soil and stuff as well. So this is like an organization that has probably taken on contracts from large organizations that wanted someone to deal with their waste. And of course, the problem is now that actually dealing with waste, disposing of waste correctly is incredibly expensive. And so that starts to spawn the opportunity for criminals to basically say, hey, we'll take your waste, we'll dispose of it, reasonably cheaply. And, don't worry, we'll pay all of those fees and things to have it disposed of properly. And then they just take it to a field and dump it. And even if that operation costs them hundreds of thousands of pounds, they're avoiding, perhaps millions of pounds in fees. And so effectively they can just pocket the difference. And there's actually, in all of this, a fascinating connection to one of our favorite topics, James, which is house building, and in fact, the latest budget.
Oh, fantastic. Is this how the budget leak happened? Did someone just find it in a pile of waste or something?
I did have a quick look with the drone. I didn't see anything signed Rachel Reeves, but and obviously the pile, we should say, is a crime scene now, so I couldn't actually walk up to it. I could only look at it from a distance, longingly. But one of the tax raising measures that was scrapped for this budget was a proposed landfill tax on builders. And this is something that caused a massive storm. Britain Remade were leading the campaign against it. Essentially, this was a crazy idea to increase the landfill tax for builders by something like 3,000%. And you can read more about this. There's an author, Michael Hill, who's got a great post on it at the Britain Remade Substack. But essentially, this would have added something like £20,000 to the cost of an average house, which is complete madness. But it's effectively coming up with taxes like these, combined with not really thinking about the enforcement side of it, that basically leads to situations like the one we have now in Oxfordshire. There's been a previous incident in Kent as well, because you're basically creating this market for dodgy waste companies to spring up, charge builders, say, 10k a house to take away the rubbish, and then dump it in a field somewhere.
You can sort of see how ideas for taxes like this sort of emerge, because presumably everyone sits around thinking, well, landfills are bad, we need to raise some money, let's just tax landfills more because landfills are bad, forgetting it could have this sort of knock-on effect. So what's the plan, Martin? So we've talked about the situation that's going on there, we don't want to speculate any further on the specifics there, but is there actually a plan now to clear this up? Because obviously this is still a problem that exists. Is anyone working out how to get rid of the rubbish and dispose of it properly?
So this is the part that's quite frustrating, because fundamentally, right, there are two things that everyone can agree on. So first of all, you want to get the site cleared up, because it's environmental disaster is maybe a strong word. It's, mostly paper, cardboard, some plastics, but it is right next to a river. You do want to get it cleaned up before it causes any kind of hazard or before it falls into the river. And in an ideal world, it would be great if the criminals could pay for it. But in a sensible world, you would separate those two things out, right?
Yeah, so I guess the site should get cleaned up quickly as possible, and then we're about getting the money back later.
Right, that's what you would expect to happen. But British bureaucracy, as we know, is not particularly sensible. And it doesn't necessarily care about the big pile of rubbish if there are other things that are more risky to it. Like, for example, what if my agency ends up carrying the can for all of the costs and the risks associated with this? So at the local end, the council physically can't clear up the site. And again, this is where we have to talk about the scale of this thing, because we're talking that there are estimates that to clear up all of this rubbish would cost more than the entire annual budget of Cherwell Council. So they basically just can't afford it, which I guess is fair enough. The police obviously aren't equipped for it. I guess if this was 1935, we'd send in the army. But that's got its own problems and probably isn't really what it used to be. And there's, I imagine, all sorts of, sorry, we can't take part in the latest NATO capacity planning because there's a big kind of crap in Oxfordshire. We got to shift. See you next year. So the agency you would expect to do something is the Environment Agency, but in this case, as in previous cases, their starting position is, yeah, well, it would be nice to clean it up, but it's not really our statutory responsibility.
This is actually weirdly similar to something that's happened near me. I haven't spoken about this on the podcast yet, but we will actually talk about this at some point in the future, I'm sure. There's basically a collapsed road, and there's a whole dispute about whether it's the council's problem or Thames Water's problem, because it was like water subsidence which caused the collapse, or seems to have caused the collapse. And basically, yeah, because of that, because no one wants to fully take responsibility, it's just been sort of left there to fester. So I guess this is sort of an endemic problem with how a lot of British institutions interact. So do we have any sense in this case of the rubbish pile of who's responsible for it now?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, we've talked about Old Bridge Way in the past, and that's a very similar example of someone who basically says, well, we're not going to pay for it, but then, okay, then there's no plan to get it fixed. The Environment Agency say, well, it's the criminals who should pay. But they also have a statement on their site recently where they mentioned that, well, by the way, this is a very complex investigation and it could be years before the taxpayer sees any money back from the criminals. And again, in that case, that's sort of academic. Like, obviously, yes, you want to try and get the money back at some point, but you need to do something about it now. And the reality is nobody really wants to take ownership of that unless they have to. And the incentive structure for basically every agency or government involved is to deny responsibility so that it doesn't land on their budget.
This is infuriating, Martin. And I think that when I was looking into the situation near me, and I could be talking rubbish here, no pun intended, but I think in other countries, I think in France, for example, when there is a sort of a problem like this or a natural disaster or like a flood or something, generally the attitude is, no, go in and fix it, and then worry about recovering the costs later on.
Yeah, and this is exactly the sort of situation that national government should be for. So an effective government with strong relationships with institutions would just say, hey, clear this up, spend whatever, we'll bankroll it, and we'll worry about, reimbursing and all that kind of stuff later on. And if you have a culture in government of trust and not being absolutely terrified of any kind of risk, and institutions that actually wanted to take ownership of problems, you wouldn't even need 10 Downing Street to issue the orders. You would just get it done. But actually, this is what ended up happening with a previous rubbish pile in Kent. It basically sat there for, I think, the best part of a year until essentially the government had to step in and order people to clean it up. And then they sort of did so, but it was a bit like getting a teenager to tidy their bedroom, with kind of great reluctance.
That pile of rubbish in Kent has a name, Martin. It's called Maidstone.
Another town that we can strike off from the list of potential podcast sponsors.
I don't think I've ever actually been there. Kent's just quite a pleasant place. Everywhere's quite nice. I was just thinking, what's like a grim type place in Kent? But that's what came to me.
Well, the problem with Maidstone is everyone confuses it with Maidenhead. So when I used to live in Maidenhead, I'd say, I'm from Maidenhead, and they'd say, in Kent, and I'd say, hell no. No offense. No offense to the entirety of Kent. But anyway, moving swiftly on. This is why I find the story so fascinating, though, right? Because in a way, that big pile of rubbish is basically a monument to kind of all of the issues that we talk about on this podcast. It's like a symbol, the Nelson's column of government's inaction. It's basically sitting there because everyone is too frightened to take on the risk or the responsibility for shifting it. I mean, the Environment Agency have known about this from July. They're still issuing statements saying, we're thinking about putting sandbags in the river and we'll come up with a plan at some point, but it's very difficult. Like, you've had 5 months to come up with a plan at this point that this pile has been sitting there. And for some of that time, getting bigger because you basically didn't do much about it for the first 3 months. Like, how much more planning do you need? Like, what needs to happen is fairly straightforward. But, again, there's just no sort of real bias towards action. And meanwhile, the actual big risk, which is that it's sitting right next to the River Cherwell and could cause a massive incident of pollution there, nobody really seems to care about. And I think there's this bigger sort of issue of national malaise, and I don't want to come on yet again to the question of this is how you get reform. But when we're talking about the budget or policing or generally the service that people feel that they're getting for all of the billions of pounds that we spend on the environment and agencies and policing, I think this stuff massively erodes public trust in government, because why should I follow all of these arcane recycling rules and have 10 different bins if someone else can just send 500 trucks up the A34 and dump it all in a field? In fact, how do I know that the stuff I'm sending for recycling hasn't already ended up there? And why was a woman fined for pouring a cup of coffee down a drain when people can do something on this scale and pretty blatantly and for the most part unchallenged? And why are our roads covered in cameras to catch out drivers, and yet we can't spot a massive convoy of heavy vehicles carrying rubbish from site to site? People act as if public sentiment is like some kind of big mystery, but honestly, get this kind of stuff right and visibly be seen to be sorting these problems out, show that level of competence, and I think it would go a long way to building public trust.
I do completely agree with you, Martin, but I do worry that by complaining about speed cameras and petty fines that we are telling as Telegraph columnists. So yes, tune in next week when we'll be talking about why political correctness has gone mad again.
Exactly. And meanwhile, let's just get the diggers in.
So, Martin, we've talked on the show a number of times now, I think, over the last few months about Ebbsfleet, which is, I live close to Ebbsfleet, so it's a very interesting place to me. It's one of the only sort of new towns or new town-ish places under construction in the country. It's a former quarry just to the southeast of London where they're building 15,000 new homes. And there was going to be a whole new town centre there called Ebbsfleet Central, but it got scuppered by some rare jumping spiders. This was a result of your favourite Quango, Martin, Natural England. They created an area of special scientific interest, which has basically slowed down building progress on this massive new area, which could have been thousands of homes, businesses, lots of exciting things happening. And the reason I mention it is because this week, friend of the pod, Chris Curtis, MP, actually came down to Ebbsfleet and I went to meet him. We had a look around the area together to see what was what. We went and stood on the peninsula, which in the good timeline would have been a theme park under construction. We saw the cliff, which the spiders can't cross, but apparently the SSSI can and can stop the development from happening. And so, I just caught up with Chris in a local coffee shop there, and we had a chat about what he's doing, why he came down all the way from Milton Keynes, where he's the MP for, to have a look at the area. And he told me more about the tour he's calling JFDI. So I'm here in Ebbsfleet with Chris Curtis. I'm nearby. Chris, you're visiting for the day. What's your big take on Ebbsfleet, having now seen the place?
Thank you for having me. And thank you for showing me around. We're in the local cafe here. No, it's been really interesting. Look, it's fantastic to see the progress that's being made. So really quite beautiful, actually, new housing estate that's been built here. Thousands of new homes going in. I heard somewhere it's one of the fastest build-out rates in the country. Great news. But at the same time, it's still incredibly frustrating that, for those of you who don't know, that effectively the suburban bit of Ebbsfleet is getting built all right, but the central bit, potentially the most exciting bit, because that'll be built really dense. It's right by a railway station where you can get 18 minutes into central London, into King's Cross, or into St Pancras. That's still struggling to get built because of, among other things, just how much of a blocker Natural England have been with their views that their obstructionist attitude to getting things built because of their sort of slightly bonkers approach to protecting nature that doesn't really protect nature. So it's good to see the progress. It's frustrating to see the blockers that are in the way when this country is so desperate for new homes to get built.
And you're down here today, and you've told me this is your JFDI tour. So what does this stand for, and what are you trying to say?
Yeah, we're going around the country visiting different things that we think should be getting built, but aren't getting built because of insane blockages through the government system. So my view of having been an MP for however many months it is, about 15 now, is too often we've got a culture across government that tries to find reasons to say no to getting things done, particularly true with big infrastructure or building projects. Everybody likes to keep throwing blockages in the way. And that means that we don't have the homes, the infrastructure, the energy generation that this country so desperately needs. So we're going across the country to visit various of these projects. And the sort of central bit of Ebbsfleet here today is another example of them. To basically go, look, we need to get out of this culture. We need to stop trying to find ways to say no to building what this country so desperately needs and start finding ways to say yes. And we just need to just fucking do it.
Fantastic. And where else have you been to visit? You told me you went to Loch Ness. How was that?
Yeah, we got a few booked in. So the second one, we went up to Loch Ness because As you'll know, Scotland generates lots of energy, but a lot of it is generated through wind. Sometimes the wind isn't blowing. You need to balance that. Most effective way of balancing it, so we can use batteries in this day and age, but also is hydroelectric. We haven't built a hydroelectric plant in the UK since the 1980s. We know we're going to need one in Scotland, and yet for slightly bonkers reasons, we haven't got one. There's one ready to go on Loch Ness, struggling to get through the planning system, struggling to get off-gem support, which would need to be required. So how can we just get on and do it? And that would mean that you would be able to balance the energy network across Scotland. It would help bring down people's bills. It would help ensure that we've got that more reliable energy support into the future. We still haven't managed to get it over the line. So just visiting projects like that to see if I can keep making noise about how we need to get them done.
It's always very nice to have someone in Parliament banging the drum for building things, Chris. But very finally, you're here in Ebbsfleet. It's a very lovely place. I think I like visiting Ebbsfleet and seeing Ebbsfleet, and we're in a lovely coffee shop. Now, I know how much you love Milton Keynes, but surely you must be a little bit tempted to make the move down south and
Absolutely not. Milton Keynes is... I'll tell you what, there are many things that we've learned today from how the Ebbsfleet Development Corporation has made this an incredible place to live. And I want to ensure that we learn the lessons about what has gone right here and what has gone wrong here. We're about to do new developments in Milton Keynes. It was listed on the New Towns Task Force. What can we learn from here to ensure that Milton Keynes is successful as well? That's what I want to do. And I'm going to continue calling Milton Keynes my home while I do it.
Chris Curtis, thank you very much. Okay, Martin, before we get to this week's guest, let's do a quick bit of housekeeping. So if you're enjoying the Abundance Agenda this week, do head over to Apple Podcasts, give us 5 stars, and then share the link with friends and family and nerds you know, basically.
Yeah, and people on the street, like people that might be driving past you in a car. Stop the car. If you're at traffic lights and you're the first person at the traffic light and it turns green, don't take off like a chump. Get out of your car, approach the driver behind and say, hey, have you heard about this amazing new podcast by James and Martin? It's called The Abundance Agenda. And, tune their radio or podcast machine or whatever they have in their car into it, and then get in and drive off. And they will definitely be grateful and thank you for introducing them to that in their morning commutes.
I'm feeling passive anxiety just imagining being in the car just behind, seeing someone faffing around, leaning through the window, trying to faff around with their phone. Just be a whole nightmare. But yeah, no, in principle, though, Martin, I agree with you. Do share the show. Do tell people about it. So, Martin, in addition to this, though, we also write our own Substack newsletters. Have you been writing about anything this week, or have you just been coasting on your videography success?
No, I've very much been coasting this week, James. It's a relaxing week of watching the YouTube hits come in, establishing my reputation as Britain's answer to Steven Spielberg, and generally prancing around in piles of rubbish. And ironically, since that's gone out, the council have suspended our recycling service, which I can only assume is some kind of dastardly retaliation. So it may well be the case that I'm investigating that in a Substack post quite soon. So stay tuned. Anyway, what have you been doing, James? What personal vendettas have you been pursuing?
Yeah, so the score I've been settling this week is with the AI unbelievers. Now, I know you're sort of one, Martin, but we've got more nuances. We did a very good episode, I think, on our relative views on AI and debating whether it's important a while back. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But this week, I basically explained how I actually use AI. I thought this would be quite interesting, and it seems to have gone down quite well, because I think a big problem with tools like ChatGPT and stuff, the big divide seems to be people who sort of understand what it can do, people who can see value in it, and a lot of people who still can't. So I thought, as I'm a sort of wide-eyed, naive AI believer in that it's quite important, I thought I'd explain how I do actually use this thing, use ChatGPT more or less constantly. So yeah, go and have a look at that. We'll put links to both of our Substacks on our website on abundancepod.com.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that AI can be a really powerful tool to help mediocre people achieve greater results. And so it's fantastic that you've been able to demonstrate that, James, through your writing. I think lots of listeners will be inspired.
Anyway, let's get on to this week's interview before I cry. So this week, we've been speaking to Laura Ryan, who is a senior analyst for science and technology policy at the Tony Blair Institute. She's big on meta-science, the idea of how we can actually do science better. And she's come out with a paper which I've heard described by a friend of mine as like the most important paper that TBI have ever put out. So it's a really interesting chat about how we can actually discover stuff and do big, proper, important science much faster than we're doing now. So yeah, here's my chat with Laura from earlier this week. So I'm delighted to be joined now by Laura Ryan, who's a senior analyst for science and technology policy at the Tony Blair Institute. Laura, we're delighted to have you on the show because you've written an absolutely fascinating paper pitching a bit of a shake-up in how Britain does science. So the paper is called A New National Purpose, Reimagining UK Science and Technology Through Lovelace Disruptive Invention Laboratories. So what is this all about? What is the problem, first of all, that you're trying to solve? What is the big problem with how Britain does science at present?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's a snappy name for a paper, I know. What is the problem with how we do science? A great question. I think there are overarching problems with our system that are common to all kinds of scientific research, and those include the short-termism that is encouraged by grant applications, meaning that it's very difficult to undertake a particularly long-term project. Linked to that is the manner in which we share scientific information. So the way that things work in a lab, for anyone who's unfamiliar, is you undertake a project of work, and then the expected output of that will be a publication in a scientific journal. And your continued funding is, in many senses, linked to the continued publication of those papers. And the timelines on both of those things tend to be in the couple of year at maximum sort of time range. And often a professor will have to have quite a few project papers ongoing to kind of keep the engine running and keep their lab afloat. And that makes it very hard to undertake projects that are much more long term than that. And it also affects risk levels, because as you can imagine, if the continued running of your lab is dependent on bringing in this money from grants by publishing papers, and the career trajectories of everyone who works in your lab is also dependent on their publication on particular timelines, that constrains the level of risk that you're going to be comfortable with. So it tends to move people towards safer projects on shorter timelines. And then there are all sorts of other kind of dynamics on top of that, like, for instance, that if you publish in popular fields, you'll be more likely to generate more citations, and that will help you with your career prospects, as opposed to publishing very wacky science that's very difficult for other people to understand, or it's a very new or small field. So those are some of the kind of general problems. I think for me, the main one actually facing the UK today is actually about career progression for young researchers. It takes a very, very long time to get to a point where you have reasonable autonomy over your own research program. And that is one of the main reasons why I've heard a lot of young people wanting to leave science. I think that there's a bit of a, not a misconception, because these are important factors, but I think people tend to think that what puts young scientists off staying in research is that it's very poorly paid and that the career prospects are very insecure. And those things are both true and are deterrents. But I think the more important deterrent, at least from my experience and the collective experience of others I've spoken to who've recently come through British universities, is that they see others in the lab hustling to get a paper on a particular timeline so that they can get the fellowship that they're looking for, or so that they can publish a paper that will impress their PI. And that's a pretty reasonable driver of research misconduct. If you've worked on something for 6 months and then it proves to be a dead lead, that'll terrify a PhD student or a postdoc, because it shouldn't. That's good science. If you proved the null hypothesis with very exemplary science, that shouldn't scare you at all. But you'll absolutely panic if you waste months on something that doesn't work out, because what do you have to show for it? How are you going to improve in your career? And so I think finding a career path that works for young scientists was one of the primary drivers for us.
So that's the problem with science as it is at the moment, and how things are done and how it's funded and so on. And you're proposing the creation of these disruptive invention laboratories. So tell me, what's the big idea here? How are we going to disrupt things?
So the idea with the labs that we're proposing was sort of born out of two different streams. James Phillips, who has been thinking about this kind of stuff for a very, very long time, had been conducting interviews with a number of Nobel Prize winning scientists, Alan Kay, Eric Betzig and Sidney Brenner. And he was trying to find out what was it about some of these 20th century labs that made them so excellent at conducting long-term high-risk research and supporting young researchers. And he found through these interviews that a lot of the structural principles that they cited as what they thought were the most important were very similar between the three kind of common principles. At the same time, Alvin did his PhD in the same lab as me. He was a co-author on the paper. We were kind of butting up against some of the issues that I just described in the lab, and we were sort of getting increasingly frustrated with the lack of diversity in the system, that there didn't seem to be any labs that had managed to free themselves from some of these pressures and that could provide the kind of scientific environment that we would love to work in. And so we ended up linking up with James, our ideas kind of aligned, and that was the birth of this paper. So in the paper, we argue that we need a new network of public labs that are designed to support higher agency, like risk-taking and longer-term projects. And as part of that, we advocate for small interdisciplinary teams with a focus on early career researchers and making sure that we're making use of some of this talent that I think is currently bleeding out of the research system altogether. And a critical element that I haven't mentioned yet is the integration of discovery science and invention, or science and engineering, which can also be very difficult within university labs, which tend to be organized by discipline, by field. You're a molecular biology lab, you're a discovery lab, this is an applied lab, this is a basic lab. Whereas a common feature between the labs that we've been interested in is that they completely mixed those together. There was no such thing as an applied basic distinction. Somebody would invent a tool, that tool would enable a new discovery, that discovery would prompt the need for perhaps a different new tool, they might make a prototype, it would sort of work in that iterative fashion. And to facilitate that, they would have very fluid kind of startup style team structures rather than very hierarchical top-down teams with a professor at the top and a group of sort of 20 underlings taking on their work.
So you're looking for really like breakthrough ideas, big new inventions. And in the paper, I think you cite historically, interestingly, like the Bell Labs or Xerox in America, who were these companies in, I don't know, the mid-20th century who basically helped create the internet, I guess, eventually. And then more recently, we've had like DeepMind as well. They're all private sector labs, as it were, coming up with these ideas. I guess you want to take some of that sort of way of doing things, because this is very different from the idea of being attached to a university and, you know, everyone working there also doing some teaching and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think actually the critical thing, it's a good thing to have noticed, but like, it's not just that they're private sector, because they're not private sector in the sense that they don't operate in like a competitive market in the way that you might think. So we talk about this a little bit in the report, but each of those is the research arm of like a huge effective monopolistic company. And our sort of theory that we put forward in the report is that that kind of lack of short-term commercial pressure is very important to be able to invest in this kind of very long-term high-risk science. So obviously Bell Labs was AT&T's sort of research arm, Xerox PARC was from Xerox's printing monopoly. And I actually think that the rise of places like DeepMind is nice evidence for our thesis, in the sense that now the kinds of companies that can pursue this kind of high-risk long-term work now are the tech giants who can have their own sort of research. The one example we used that you didn't mention was the LMB in Cambridge, which is not private. That's funded by the Medical Research Council. And there is a lot of scholarship on Bell Labs and Xerox PARC. There are fantastic books about each of those. The LMB, there isn't quite so much research that's already been done. There isn't a book. I hope someone will write one. But I think adding that in to the mix hopefully enriches our argument a little bit to show that this kind of thing can be done in the public sector, and it has been done in the public sector before. And so the LMB is in many senses a really great model for the kind of thing that we're proposing today.
Fantastic. And what sort of problems do you envisage these labs working on? Can you sort of sketch out the big breakthrough things that they could help invent?
I can't. If I could, I would quit whatever I'm doing and I'd be working on like the next internet. I think there's a great quote from Max Perutz. I can't remember if it actually made it into the paper in the end or not, but he talks about how these kinds of field or industry creating discoveries can't be planned. You can't like legislate them into existence. Even if you come up with the perfect interdisciplinary structures, you can't ensure that this is going to happen. He uses sort of Renaissance Florence as an example and says like, what were the interdisciplinary structures that allowed that? But what you can do is kill the chance for those kinds of discoveries to snowball into new fields and industries with the wrong incentives in the ecosystem. And so I suppose what we're advocating for is carving out like a small part of fertile ground where when these types of visions arise or these kinds of discoveries arise, there isn't this like dampening force that prevents them from snowballing. That being said, we would, as a next step in Lovelace, advocate that you'd need to have like a fairly expansive scoping exercise to try and tap into networks of scientists and technologists, try and like work out where their interesting visions are for the futures of field. But yeah, I mean, obviously these ideas aren't like, I can't just decide, it'd be great if there were 5, let's find them. I think we do in the report try and like give an idea of the kind of thing we're talking about in our explanation of why the LMB was so important in founding the field of molecular biology, for example, or why Xerox PARC was so important in the history of personal computing. So I think those would be, examples of the kind of thing we're talking about.
So I think in the paper, you say you want the labs to avoid generic amorphous research areas, and you don't want just the biotechnology lab or the AI lab or the quantum lab. So I guess I'm just trying to get it like, what would this look like in practice? A lab is created, there's a building with, I don't know what scientists use, Bunsen burners and pipettes and so on inside there. When you create a lab and you put on its foundation document, this is what you are going to do. How do you write that sort of object? What do you say their objective is?
So firstly, like we certainly would not want to like plan that in a top-down fashion. The idea of the scoping exercise would be to identify potential directors for labs, and it would be those directors' visions for the future of their field that would be the North Star for that particular lab. But I think the benefit of thinking about these kinds of things in terms of visions rather than, for instance, an FRO is something that people bring up often in these kind of conversations about new institutions. An FRO has a very defined goal that they're moving towards. And so a lot of its structures, management styles would be quite different to what we're proposing. The benefit of having this kind of visionary framing around an institute, there are a couple, but one is flexibility. It means that you have a kind of North Star, but you're somewhat agnostic as to how you get there. And so you have the opportunity to follow interesting and surprising things as they arise. You can cut research programs. No one is sort of too precious about any individual line of inquiry. Second is like having that kind of vision just on a purely technical level means that you have enough overlap between things that scientists are working on to provide them very strong core facilities in a building that's very well aligned to that purpose. So perhaps I'll give an example because I know this is all a bit ephemeral for those who haven't read the paper. So like the lab of molecular biology would be a perfect example here. At the time, there wasn't really such thing as molecular biology. That was kind of invented in the LMB. And so the group who that institute was built around was a mixed discipline group. You had biologists, crystallographers, physicists, chemists, and the kind of shared idea that they were pursuing, their vision was that interactions between molecules was going to be the fundamentally important lens through which we look at biology in the next sort of century. And like they were proven right, that's ended up being the foundation of all modern medicine, biotechnology. But at the time, that was like a fairly niche view of what the future of biology was going to look like, that it was going to be combinations of molecules and how they interact that would be the decisive lens. And so now we could say that molecular biology is the LMB's sort of discipline, but it wasn't that just sort of field at the time. It was a sort of shared vision. And Xerox PARC, similar. The computers pre-Xerox PARC, and it wasn't just Xerox PARC, it's other elements, many of which were funded by the ARPA computing program, but before their interventions, computers were these huge like mainframe machines where you would go in and you would put in your calculation within a pretty predetermined and pretty confined set of options. You'd ask it your question, you'd like go for lunch, come back, and it would have spat out your answer. But there were a couple of different technologists at the time who had this vision for computing. Particularly, there's a great paper called Man-Computer Symbiosis by J.C.R. Licklider, and he viewed the future of computers as these like intellectual amplifiers for individual people, that they would be these like small portable devices that would exchange information and would be involved in the thinking process alongside humans, which is just like a fundamentally different vision for computing than what people were operating on at the time. They probably thought that if anything, these mainframe computers might get even bigger. They might like increase processing speed or something, but his view was like a total paradigm shift. And that was the basis for the kind of personal computing revolution. So this is what we mean when we say visions.
I guess related to that, and maybe this is a sort of the implicitly slightly, I don't know, this is the controversial thing you're pitching, I guess. I suppose you're going to need like a slightly messianic sort of founder types, like how startups, like how your Musks and your Zuckerbergs or whoever, they're able to impress their view on their organization and drive it in a direction and invent new stuff for better or for worse. I guess in the same sense, these labs are going to need that sort of strong figure at the center. Go, here's my idea about how things are going to work. And you're going to have to sort of lead them to it and trust them to do it, rather than have to go, oh, you've got to go back to the committee and get this signed off and do all this sort of stuff. And that's the sort of the change in perspective.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's undoubtedly true to a level. I think there are obviously different skill sets at play here. It may be the case that the actual sort of visionary, I mean, you know that the stereotype of the visionary scientist with Licklider, for instance, I think there's a quote about he was like a weird guy. He was always just like hanging around, and then we left him alone for 3 years and he came back with the internet. So like it needn't be the case that individual people embody all of these different archetypes, that they're the kind of visionary scientist and the messianic leader. And but you're certainly right about the committee element, that this is not the kind of science that you want to be having to continue referring up for approval from distant bureaucracies who aren't familiar with the research program. That's like a pretty integral principle that runs through the report, which is that it's understandable that the larger scale a program of science is, and the further away the decision bodies are, the more crude the metrics have to be that they use for assessment. Whereas in the kind of small network that we're talking about, we want the principle of review to be that reviews are carried out by people who are very, very close to the science themselves and are intimately familiar with it. And so they can be, in many senses, much more qualitative than quantitative. And they don't need to rely on crude metrics like have you published in the last couple of years, for instance. I think it was Higgs said in a Guardian article a couple of years ago that he doesn't think that he would be able to pursue the kind of science that he did in the 60s today, because somebody would be asking him, like, you haven't published anything since the Higgs particle in... So yeah, there's definitely an element of internal assessment, close review that is integral, and lack of decision-making by committee.
And I guess the complementary side to that is that you're also basically asking the government to take more risks. So if the government wants to put up some cash to build these labs, you need to say to them, you need to put the money there. And some of these things, maybe they're not going to work out, and we need to be more comfortable with that.
I think, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Two things I would say on that. The first is that it depends on like what the definition of not working out is. For instance, like it may be the case that the kind of grand vision for the future of a field does not come to fruition, but one to have failed, would that mean that the institute would have to have not produced science on par with the kind of average university lab in the time that it's running? Personally, I think that that's very, very unlikely, because although the vision element, I think, is very important for the kind of field birthing and industry birthing science that we're talking about, the structures that we're advocating, I think, would be in many senses an improvement on the status quo, regardless of whether we're thinking about this kind of visionary frontier science. I think those structures are just better suited to the pursuit of research. So I'm reasonably confident that even if some of these sort of big bets don't create the next personal computing revolution or the next molecular biology revolution, they would still be far above average performing scientific institutes for the United Kingdom. But the second is that, yeah, I think we do need a greater amount of risk, comfortability with risk. I think if you think of a portfolio of institutes for a country, you don't want all of your research money to be funneled into one specific model. I think like the university model is great for some things. It's kind of coming up against its limits at the moment, I think, in some ways, as demonstrated by this crisis in postdoc hiring and PhD students leaving, and the sort of broader problems that the university sector is facing at the moment. But I think over-reliance on one model is a strategic vulnerability, and carving out a small space for higher risk research and allowing that to be genuinely high risk, which requires comfortability with some failure, is very important for having a good kind of exploitation balance. And I think we've realized this with science funding, as evidenced by ARIA. Like ARIA is a fantastic example of...
Just for people listening, this is the research agency. It was actually started by Dominic Cummings, but don't hold that against him. It's a good idea to do this cutting edge sort of crazy stuff. I went to a talk ARIA did once about how they want to create programmable plants, which blew my mind a bit. The idea is changing the genes of plants to just do the stuff we need it to. I don't know, to create new drugs or something. It was crazy sci-fi stuff.
Actually, my mum works on basically
exactly
that. But it is, you're right, like, it is amazing. It is amazing what science can do. But yeah, I mean, ARIA is a fantastic example of the kind of principle that I'm talking here, that we should have different models for funding different kinds of science, that the model should be suited to the kind of science that you're trying to support. And so we really view Lovelace as the kind of next complementary step to ARIA, whereby perhaps programs incubated in ARIA, funded by ARIA, might eventually find that they need a physical space to really like bring them to fruition. And the same with programs in universities, programs that currently don't exist anywhere, startups. With the idea is that Lovelace will provide this physical infrastructure that can help scale some of these ideas, because I think physical co-location is so important for science and technology.
And talking of co-location, there's no like leveling up perspective on this. Do we want these super clever, smart people? Do we want to put them in Oxford and Cambridge and London, where a lot of smart people already are, or can we use this to help sort of level up other areas as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think realistically they must go where it makes most sense for them to go scientifically, and that may well be around the Oxford-Cambridge arc and around London in many cases. I definitely don't think exclusively. There are for sure like very bright spots in particular fields all around the country. So it would be dictated by the focus of that lab and where it makes sense for them to be. Perhaps there's a university with very strong core facilities or a very strong department or equipment that would be helpful. So they should certainly be guided primarily by scientific need and not a sort of levelling up agenda. But that's not to say that they would all, in fact, end up being in the south of England.
Fantastic. And very finally, so it's a really fantastic paper. I do recommend going and checking it out if you're listening and you're intrigued by this. I think this is a great idea personally, and I hope it's taken up by the government. But paint a picture for me very finally. So I don't know, the year is 2035. I don't want to think how old I'll be then. But I go to visit one of these new labs. What do I see happening there? What's different and what has changed and what are they doing that's good for the country?
Well, good question. What's happening there? I think you walk in and you see a lot younger of a workforce than others. To be fair, that is what you see in a normal lab. It's just that they're in a much more hierarchical structure. But you see small teams of empowered early career researchers. You see very modular spaces. You might see them like taking a wall down, if that makes sense for an experiment that they do. You see engineers. You see lots more meeting rooms. We're very keen that in service of sort of Lovelace Institutes acting as nuclei for new fields and industries, you would also see a lot of like workshops for the broader scientific community, for industry. You'd see conferences. You'd see this like network with gravity outside of the university system that meant that young researchers were confident in leaving academia, that they would have this alternative network that could provide career prospects for them in the reasonably long term. And hopefully you would see at least one sort of new LMB for the United Kingdom with small startups founding around it and larger companies like Cambridge Antibody Technology. You'd start to see the beginning of a new industrial ecosystem with one of these Lovelace labs at its kind of heart as the kind of scientific engine.
On that note, Laura, we'll put links to the paper on abundancepod.com. But for now, Laura Ryan, thank you very much. And that's just about it for this week's show. Martin, how do you think it's gone?
James, it's been a show. I think there are going to be many opinions about it, but I think all of us can agree it has been a show. And there'll be another one next week.
And with that sort of enthusiasm, who cannot wait to tune in? So yeah, in the meantime, go back, check out the back catalogue. The AI episode, like I say, was a good debate, I think. You can listen to that at abundancepod.com. Also check out our newsletters. I've been writing about stuff. Martin's been writing about stuff and creating amazing videos. Go and check those out. Abundancepod.com. All the links are there. But for now, thanks for listening.
See you next week.